Today, our speaker is John Villasenor. He is an electrical engineering and public policy at UCLA. You don't realize this, John. I can say UCLA because I know you and everything, but when administrators that I hang around with, I'll say that place on the other side of the but we'll just say UCLA. He's also a non-resident senior scholar at the Brookings Institution. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a senior national fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Cybersecurity. So he's going to address a very important topic of the intersection of digital technology, public policy, and law. And he's going to apply that broad framework to the question of drones in the United States.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks to all of you for coming. I know you all are busy, and so let me tell you a few things. So first of all, I welcome questions, interruptions at any time. If you have any questions, please speak up. The other thing I'll tell you is that this will be a shorter presentation and not a longer presentation. So you don't have to think, oh my gosh, is this guy going to keep us to like 1:30? So no, this will be relative. I'm aiming for kind of a 40-minute-ish, thing. But anyway. So we're going to talk about drones. Before we do that, and so I don't end up being viewed as the drone guy, I do a bunch of stuff. My interest, as Dean Knott said, I'm interested in sort of this intersection of information technology with policy and law. So just other things that I'm doing a lot of work on: cybersecurity, critical topic obviously these days. Communications technology. I don't need to tell you how much communications has sort of revolutionized kind of the way we interact with the world. And there's a whole bunch of really interesting policy issues that many of you are, I'm sure, very familiar with. In that sort of subset of that would be related is digital media policy, how we access and consume content, and what the rules and policies and challenges are there. I'm involved in and really helping run a big effort at the Brookings Institution, supported by the Gates Foundation, on financial inclusion for unbanked populations. This is people in the developing world, the 2 billion or whatever people in the developing world who don't actually have access to formal financial services, and how can you use technology and other tools to get them into the financial system. I actually teach intellectual property at the UCLA Anderson School of Management, and I've done a lot of work in IP issues. And then also I'm very active, have some support from Google, looking at child and youth online safety. So this is kind of a portfolio of activities. They may seem disparate, but they all tie together this issue of how does changing information technology raise really important policy challenges. So having said that, so hopefully you won't think at the end of the day that I'm just the drone guy. We're going to spend the rest of these 35, 40 minutes talking about drones. Drones are an interesting topic. So the first thing we can talk about is what is a drone, right? So obviously we sort of have some general ideas, but the term, the attention is new in the broader, kind of broader press, but the term is not. In fact, in the years leading up to and during World War II, drone was used by the military to describe an aircraft that was a sort of a regular aircraft that was refitted so it could be operated without a person in it, and they were used for target practice to teach people how to shoot down airplanes in World War II. Today, the term is of course often used for any unmanned aircraft. There's a few other terms you might see: unmanned aerial vehicle, remotely piloted aircraft, unmanned aircraft system, UAS being kind of the more formal term you see in a lot of the legislation. RPA often being a term that's used in the military. So these terms are somewhat interchangeable. So you'll see them somewhat interchangeably in this presentation and in the press. So I should also say that without in any way diminishing the importance of the discussion of drone use overseas, this talk is focused on domestic unmanned aircraft system applications and the issues that arise. So let me just ask some questions. What can you use drones for in a domestic context, in a non-military, civilian, U.S. context? What are some examples?
Deliver pizza.
Deliver pizza. Well, that's a great answer. Now, I think we're probably a little far away from that for reasons, but it is not an unreasonable answer, because there's been some press about that, thanks to Mr. Bezos.
Photography?
Yeah, aerial photography is a great use. What else?
Monitor agriculture.
Agricultural. Yep. What else? Any others?
Search and rescue.
Search and rescue. Absolutely.
Private surveillance.
Private surveillance meaning
Your home or your property.
your own property, hopefully, right? You don't want to. What else?
Law enforcement.
law enforcement, which means a lot of different things, right? I mean, it can mean, and it is used, for example, crime scene investigation, traffic, things like that. Any other ideas? Yeah.
What about long-haul cargo?
For actually bringing something a long way. You could,
Piloted,
yeah.
747.
You could. I mean, I think we're a long way from that, but absolutely you could. I think the barriers are actually more sort of psychological than technical to that, but you're absolutely right. What else? Yeah.
How about investigating a bomb threat?
You could use it for something like that too. That's right. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Border security?
And they actually are being used on the U.S. border. So great set of answers and illustrates the various things. And so I think you've probably got a lot of these: search and rescue, disaster response, agriculture, wildfires, a big deal for spotting wildfires. Inspection of large or remote structures, right? You've got to inspect a pipeline on the North Slope, for example. Scientific research, drones have been used recently to fly through above active volcanoes to gather samples in the air above active volcanoes. That's not a task any reasonable helicopter pilot would agree to do, right? News reporting and traffic monitoring. I'll also mention that drones are used now sometimes to fly, not always, but sometimes to fly into hurricanes that are very far away. They've used Global Hawks for things like that, and the Global Hawk can stay up for 13 hours, which is far longer than a manned aircraft can stay up that does that. Law enforcement use by civil liberties groups and activists. People talk a lot about the police use, but they can also be used to monitor the police, and in fact, sometimes are. Commercial imaging, urban planning, surveying. There's a whole bunch of applications, and applications we haven't really thought of. So we can start out by sort of hopefully agreeing there's this incredible wealth of things that you can apply these to and do things either more cost effectively than you could have done them before, or simply do things that you could not have done in a traditional manned aircraft. One slide here on historical context. Unmanned aviation, in some sense, predates manned flight. The idea of designing flying machines that were heavier than air and that were powered is something that people were looking at throughout the 1800s. I mentioned the early 20th century history. Unmanned aircraft were used by the U.S. military in the 1950s and 1960s. By the 1970s and 80s, a series of countries, including not only here in the U.S., but Canada, Israel, what was then the USSR, and multiple European countries. But things have really picked up in the last, let's call it 15 years, right? If you'd said the word drone in 1995, most people, or unmanned aircraft, most people would have given you a sort of a puzzled look. If you say it today, everybody on the street knows what you're talking about. So why? Why is it that this technology, which has been sort of gradually evolving in tandem with aviation in generally for 100 years, call it, why all of a sudden has it leapt into the kind of attention of everybody, not just policymakers and technologists? Well, a couple of things. First of all, the GPS system, right? We all know about the GPS system. The GPS system isn't new. It's been around since the 70s or 80s, depending on how you count. But very inexpensive small receivers for GPS, that's newer, right? That's made it possible to put GPS receivers in things like an iPhone or a small unmanned aircraft. Low-cost, small form factor imaging technology, little tiny cameras. Why is it that cameras have gotten so small? What industry has driven that? Sorry? Silicon, absolutely. The incredible advances that we've had in semiconductor manufacturing and smartphones, right? The demand that all of us have around the world for these small form factor smartphones, that's driven enormous investments in imaging and technology. A consequence of that is that the unmanned aircraft industry can kind of ride along on that and adopt those and use those technologies. Communications technologies advances, right? The ability to wirelessly transmit stuff very easily, 20 feet or 10,000 miles matters. And also airframe design and flight control advances. So these are the things that in combination have led to this real research or growth of drones. A global industry, it's a global market. Some statistics here. The global spending on unmanned aircraft is expected to total about $90 billion cumulatively over the next 10 years, and that corresponds to an annual rate starting right now a little over $6 billion, and then 10 years from now a little over $11 billion. And there's dozens of countries that are now in the act in terms of designing unmanned aircraft. I've listed some of them here, but it's almost going to be easier soon to talk about the countries that aren't than it is to name the countries that are. It's really, almost everybody's got some program. A little bit of show and tell. I'm going to give you some examples. This is a Global Hawk. It's obviously a very large aircraft. It can stay aloft for many, many hours. It's a jet, basically, so it flies at the speed of a jet. You've probably read about these. These are used by the military for surveillance and reconnaissance. They're also used for scientific research. This is a parrot. You can buy this at Brookstone. Okay, this is It's about this big, only weighs a couple of pounds. It's quadcopter, 4 rotors here. It flies around. It's got a video camera. This is something called a Scout. It's got a little camera here. This was used, actually, was made in Canada, but this was used by the Libyan rebels when they had the revolution a couple of years ago to get overhead imagery when they were doing what they were doing. This is an interesting unmanned aircraft. This is solar powered, okay? So it looks like it looks because it's very light and it's got to have a large upper wing surface area. And this particular one has a wingspan of over 70 feet, but still only weighs about 120 pounds. And this was able to fly for 2 continuous weeks over the Arizona desert in a test about 4 years ago. Now that's 2 weeks is a long time. Boeing is developing something called a Solar Eagle, which is expected to be able to stay aloft in the stratosphere continuously for guess how much time? Any ideas? How long? That's a good guess. Not quite that, but 5 years, right? 5 years. He goes up and just turns slow circles in the stratosphere for 5 continuous years. And so that's essentially indefinitely, right? It's a long time, right? Very long time.
Is it solar powered?
Yes, it is solar powered. So what happens is it charges during the day, and then at night, it's got batteries, and Yep, absolutely. A Hummingbird. The Hummingbird was actually designed probably 10, 15 miles from here, AeroVironment, and it weighs only 2/3 of an ounce. And I'll show you a video in just a second. It has a wingspan of just over 6 inches, and it was successfully demonstrated in 2011. So 2/3 of an ounce, and it's got a camera and a bunch of stuff on it. And then what takes the cake, something called a RoboBee, which was designed by some researchers at Harvard. The first flight was announced in May of 2013. This is sort of like a robotic insect. It weighs less than, you're not going to believe this, I'm just going to tell you, 1/300th of an ounce. Okay? 1/300th of an ounce. That means you can fit like 5,000 of them in a pound, right? It's powered, to be fair, externally. It doesn't have its own power source. But still, that's pretty amazing. So let me show you a couple of, one other thing is, I'll tell you this because I'm going to show you a video about it. Argus is not an unmanned aircraft, but it's an imaging system comprised of hundreds of sort of cell phone camera-like little cameras you have in cell phones, a matrix of hundreds of them put together on the bottom of a drone that's flown around. It can get incredibly detailed imagery. So I'm going to show you some examples of what these things are. So I'm going to show you 4 very short videos. And so this is the Nano Hummingbird I mentioned that's made right here in Southern California. And hopefully this will play here. There's audio here, but it didn't start yet. So it's flying around there. Let me see if oops, I accidentally killed this thing.
And like something like this would just be used to collect imagery, or like?
Yeah, this could be used. This is a prototype of it was funded by DARPA, and so it's got a camera and things in it. And I think this was really more to prove the concept that you could actually, have something which is flapping, but a future generation of it. Yeah, it could be collecting imagery and wireless signals or whatever. So anyway, that's a Nano Hummingbird. Again, 2/3 of an ounce. Let me scoot out of that. This is an example of some very interesting maneuvers of what these
This video
do.
presents autonomous control capabilities for a quadrotor helicopter. We use a 20-camera Vicon system and an onboard IMU for state estimation. Here we show single, double, and triple flips. We developed a method for flying to any position in space with any reasonable velocity or pitch angle. We use the method to fly through windows at various angles. Here there's less than 3 inches of clearance on all sides of the quadrotor. We also fly between other quadrotors. The same method can be used to descend or ascend through a horizontal slot. By placing Velcro on the bottom of the quadrotor and on a target, the quadrotor can perch on a surface. Here we demonstrate perching on an inclined surface.
Robo Bee, this is the one that weighs 1/300th of an ounce.
This is a RoboBee. These miniature robots are inspired by the biology of bees and hive behavior. New materials, compact high-energy power sources, and new control systems. And a new method of self-assembly and pop-up manufacturing. I'm Elizabeth Farrell, a PhD student at SEAS. I am energized by the potential of an autonomous device that thinks on its own. It could impact everything from crop pollination to search and rescue. And that's science, not fiction.
And the last one I will show is about a 3 or 4 minute segment. This is from a PBS video. It's a 3 or 4 minute excerpt. Since I teach IP, I'll say that I have the authorization to show this. I paid a license fee to be able to show this PBS segment to groups like yours. So this is 3 or 4 minutes. This is about this Argus system.
This is the next generation of surveillance. For the first time, we actually have permission from the government to show the basic capabilities. It is important for the public to know that some of these capabilities exist.
Engineer Yanis Antoniadis designed the new sensor, known as Argus. With 1.8 billion pixels, it's the world's highest resolution camera. Argus fits inside this pod that attaches to the belly of a UAV. But because much of the work is classified, we can't see the sensor itself.
Because we are not allowed to expose some of the pieces that make up the sensors, so you get to look at pretty plastic curtains.
Also known as Wide Area Persistent Stare, Argus is the equivalent of having up to 100 predators look at an area the size of a medium-sized city at once. This image was taken 17,500 feet above Quantico, Virginia, and covers 15 square miles.
This whole image is at a very, very fine resolution. So if we wanted to know what is going on in any spot along this image, say near this building at this intersection, we can generate a moving image that shows what's going on in the area.
Simply by touching the screen, Antoniadis has opened up a window showing a detailed area, while still maintaining the broader context.
And everything that is a moving object is being automatically tracked. The color boxes represent that the computer has recognized the moving objects. You can see individuals crossing the street. You can see individuals walking in parking lots. There's actually enough resolution to be able to see the people waving their arms or walking around, what kind of clothes they wear. And you could pick the location of where you produce these images anywhere in the entire field of view.
Antoniadis can open up to 65 windows at once and can see objects as small as 6 inches on the ground.
From even 17,500 feet, the white thing that you see flying around is a bird.
Argus streams live to the ground and also stores everything, 1 million terabytes of video a day, which is the equivalent of 5,000 hours of high-definition footage.
So you can go back and say, I would like to see what happened at this particular location 3 days, 2 hours, 4 minutes ago, and it could actually show you exactly what happened as if you were watching it live.
Obviously, size will make a difference. What is the highest altitude they can fly? And are they going to be controlled by air traffic? Or if the number increases, what's going to happen to...
Yeah, there's a great set of questions. So there's a technology issue question about how high they can fly. And so it depends on the platform. So the solar-powered one we talked about a moment ago can go up into the stratosphere, which is 60, 70,000 feet. The Global Hawks can fly more at the sort of altitudes you might find typical of a commercial aircraft, whereas the Parrot AR, the one you can get at Brookstone, is right near the ground. So it's completely technology dependent. The other question is, are they under control? Absolutely. The FAA has jurisdiction over air traffic control, and one of the most interesting questions right now is how to integrate unmanned aircraft into the airspace, and I'll be talking a little bit about that. So yeah, it's a really important, incredibly important question. So partly in relation, who controls an unmanned aircraft? Well, a person, an onboard autopilot, or both? And if you think about it, that's the same answer you get for a regular manned aircraft, right? I mean, because when you're flying from here to New York or whatever, sometimes there's a person actually flying. I mean, there's always a person who's a pilot, but there's an autopilot, so there's things that can be done without a person actually hands on the wheel there. So the key difference, having a person control it or some sort of automated control is a factor in aviation generally, unmanned or manned. The key difference, of course, with an unmanned aircraft is the person isn't actually physically on the plane. Fully autonomous flight, completely autonomous where you push the button and off it goes and does everything is very unusual and with very narrow exceptions is unlikely to be a factor. So not unlikely to be dominant in many applications for the near future. So the key issues from a policy standpoint that people talk about arise from or are related to technology, privacy, and safety. So your question was in part related to safety to the extent of air traffic control. The popular press dialogue is dominated by the privacy discussion, and I think it's a reasonable question. It's an important question. So we talked a little bit about technology. I'm going to talk a little bit about privacy because it's so fundamental to this whole topic. So we're going to give a little bit of background on that. So first of all, the little kind of tutorial on privacy. So in this country, we have privacy from 3 different sort of sources. We've got the Constitution. We've got statutes, which are federal and state laws that have been enacted. And we have common law. And I'll very briefly explain that. The Constitution, does anyone know which amendment in the Constitution is most often cited for? Yes? The 4th Amendment. What does the 4th Amendment tell us? Anyone remember? Yeah, you're protected against unreasonable searches by who? The government. Does the 4th Amendment prevent me as an individual from doing anything? No, there's other protections, right? If I'm climbing over the neighbor's fence and looking in, that doesn't mean it's okay, but it's not the 4th Amendment which is implicated. So the Constitution gives us some privacy protections through the 4th Amendment and other amendments as well. I mean, for example, the right against self-incrimination is a form of privacy protection, right? Private information, you can't be forced to test it. Thanks to the 5th Amendment, you can't be forced to testify against yourself. That's a form of privacy. Statutory privacy protections are laws. So, for example, HIPAA, everyone knows the health law. Has privacy aspects to it. There's a Children's Online Privacy Protection Act at the federal level. There's a Privacy Act from 1974. There's lots of state-level privacy statutes that protect things like bank records, library records, school records, medical records, and so on. So the idea of statutory law-based, enacted law-based privacy protections is also very important. And finally, common law. Common law is really important. Common law is law that isn't actually, there wasn't a bill that was enacted. It's law that has arisen over the years through precedent, through earlier court decisions. So in particular, there's a tort, a wrong, called invasion of privacy, which you've all heard of. And most specifically, if someone intrudes upon your privacy, you might have a claim against them for intrusion upon seclusion or public disclosure of private facts and so on. So these 3 things are the frameworks that govern privacy generally, not only with respect to drones. Of course, they also apply to drones. So with that background, the first question you have to ask when you talk about privacy with respect to a lot of things, including drones, is privacy from whom? Okay? Privacy from government entities, from the police, the FBI, the Border Patrol, the IRS, whatever it might be, is often involving 4th Amendment and the issue of what constitutes an unreasonable search and seizure as opposed to one that is not unreasonable. Privacy from non-government entities involves the tension between the First Amendment and common law privacy protections. So what is the First Amendment? Anyone remember? Freedom of speech. And with that, though, there's also a freedom to gather information. So if I want to walk outside the street here on Exposition Boulevard and take my camera and take a picture, why do I have the right to do that? Well, one of the fundamental reasons I have the right to do that, it's a public place, and I have a First Amendment right to gather information. That's an incredibly important right with respect to news gathering, for example. Now, does my First Amendment right to gather information extend so far as to enable someone to take a ladder, put it up against someone else's house, and climb up and start taking pictures in a second floor window? Of course not, right? So the question is, what is the tension there? Where does the affirmative right to gather information collide with the right of the person against or from whom information might be gathered to have privacy? The sort of the tension between common law privacy protections on the one hand and the affirmative right to gather information on the other hand. So for drone operators who are not government entities, it's this tension which is going to determine the limits of what is allowed and what is not. So I'll briefly, 3-4 minutes, talk about the issue about privacy from government unmanned aircraft. Because if you read the debate about drones, it's like, oh gosh, we got to really address the privacy issues. So what are the privacy issues? Well, it won't surprise you that the Supreme Court has never actually addressed drone privacy. It just hasn't happened, right? There haven't been enough drones. And for a case to land in the Supreme Court, it has to go through a bunch of other courts, and that hasn't happened yet. However, there's some really interesting related case law that matters. So in 1986, or a few years prior to 1986, what happened was police in Santa Clara, California received a tip that somebody was growing marijuana in their backyard. And what happened is they flew over in a regular plane with a pilot at the controls and a police officer also on the plane. At 1,000 feet, they looked down 1,000 feet and they said, hey, that looks like marijuana plants. You know, based on this observation, we're going to get a search warrant and we're going to go and arrest you, go in your house. And they did, and they arrested the person because they found marijuana plants and so on. So this person, Ciarolo, challenged the state of California and said, hey, that was an unreasonable, you violated my Fourth Amendment rights by taking an airplane and looking down into my backyard, which you couldn't see from the street because there was a big high fence around it. Okay, so the question is, was that a Fourth Amendment violation or not? The Supreme Court said it was not a Fourth Amendment violation. Okay, it was not. What the Supreme Court said that the Fourth Amendment protection of a home has never been extended to require law enforcement officers to shield their eyes when passing by a home, right? So the analogy they made essentially is, you know, if someone is growing marijuana on their front yard without any fence, you know, is the police officer required to walk by the house like that? Well, no, of course not, right? And what they said is that logic could extend essentially to planes flying over a fenced-in backyard. What they said is the observations took place within public navigable airspace, right? The airspace above 1,000 feet was publicly navigable in a physically non-intrusive manner. And they said any member of the public flying in this airspace who glanced down could have seen everything that the officers observed. Okay? In an age where private and commercial flight is routine, it's unreasonable to respect that marijuana plants were constitutionally protected from being observed with the naked eye from an altitude of 1,000 feet. Another similar case happened in Florida a couple of years later. Same idea, marijuana in sort of someone in the immediate vicinity of someone's home, called the curtilage in legal terminology. Police used a helicopter. They found they could see through the openings in this greenhouse. This person challenged it. Again, the Supreme Court found the observations constitutional, and so that's where the case law from that stands as well. I'll give you another case, however, which goes in the other direction. This is a really important case called Kylo. What happened? The other two had to do with aerial overhead observations. This has nothing to do with airplanes even. What happened is the police suspected that somebody was growing marijuana in their house. And what they did is they got a thermal imaging device. You know what those are, right? They tell you the temperature of things. And they looked and they found that the walls of the house were much warmer than the walls of all the neighboring houses. They inferred, correctly as it turned out, that the person was growing marijuana in there. They got a search warrant based on the walls being warmer. And Kylo, the person whose house or who was arrested as a result, challenged this. And this time the Supreme Court found against the government. Okay? The Supreme Court they found that was a Fourth Amendment violation, that the police did not have the authority to obtain that information without a search warrant. They said, whereas here the government uses a device that is not in general public use to explore details of a home that would previously have been unknowable without physical intrusion, the surveillance is a search and is presumptively unreasonable without a warrant. So we have a case on the other side. Okay? So if you put these together, right? If you sort of, and there's other case law. We could have a whole law school seminar on this, but for the 5-minute version, those are the key ones. If you put these together, what does it mean for privacy from people who might be from government operators who might be flying drones, right? Well, the rulings are, you could argue they're narrow in scope. They only address naked eye observation, which obviously is not what happens in a drone because there's no naked eye, it's just the camera, right? And they only address public navigable airspace. So I'll ask a question, what is public navigable airspace? It's certainly 10,000 feet is public navigable airspace, but is the air 2 inches above the ground in your backyard publicly navigable? I would hope not, right? Wouldn't seem fair if your neighbor could start flying a little, drone around a foot above your ground and say, hey, you can't stop me because that's public, right? So the question, one of the really interesting questions that we are going to be collectively forced to answer as this technology matures is, how high above your property do you have a right to control the airspace? It's a really interesting question. It was addressed in the Supreme Court in a case called Cosby in 1946, but it didn't completely put to rest the issues that we're going to see with drones. The Kylo ruling, talking about technology in general public use, because what they said, if you remember, is the Supreme Court ruling appeared to have some tie to whether the technology was in general public use or not. You could argue that, well, when drones are in general public use, then the standard's going to change. It's not completely the end of the story, because that didn't necessarily endorse the constitutionality of using something which is generally in public use to observe the details of a home. So the bottom line is we don't have a definitive answer of exactly what the government can and can't do with respect to unmanned aircraft and observation, but there's some guideposts that we have with respect to the case law. I'll briefly talk about non-government unmanned aircraft. As I mentioned before, that privacy issue was sort of a tension between the First Amendment ability to gather information on the one hand and common law, and in some sense statutory privacy protections. These limits haven't really been tested with respect to unmanned aircraft. The key test is going to be what is a reasonable expectation of privacy. The standard to show invasion of privacy can be incredibly high. Some of you may remember the Snyder v. Phelps 2011 Supreme Court decision. This is a court, you may not remember the name, but you remember the circumstances. There's this odious group that protests at the funerals of deceased service members, right? And it's just incredibly offensive. And says that it just says unspeakable things. And so there was a legal action filed against them, among other things, alleging invasion of privacy. And the Supreme Court actually found that didn't, offensive though it was, that did not rise to the standard of being invasion of privacy. So that's a very high bar. However, there are also some other rulings. There's one here in the state of California with respect to one of these emergency road, ambulance TV shows where they filmed a woman who had been hurt in a car accident, and she was able to show that her privacy was in fact invaded even though she wasn't in the home. There are some rulings that have suggested some limits, but it's really hard to know exactly what the limits are going to be. The other thing is, there's another really interesting question, which is business privacy. So let me give you some examples. To what extent do businesses have a right to privacy from aerial observations? And you can think of some interesting hypotheticals here. What happens if private groups use unmanned aircraft to conduct aerial inspections of a facility and then report apparent violations to the government? And what happens if, for example, they aren't really violations after all, but it takes, costs the company, lots of time and money to actually prove that really everything was okay and this person was just a bit over enthusiastic, right? Really interesting questions. And there's also issues with respect to trade secrets, right? That might be exposed by these things. I'll give you an example. This isn't just theoretical. I'll give you an example. 2011, a Texas man flew an unmanned aircraft over land near a Dallas area meatpacking plant and photographed what he believed to be, and actually what turned out to be, environmental violations. He contacted the Coast Guard, and in early 2012, they served a search warrant on the company, in part, largely based on these observations acquired by this private citizen. And then once they were on the property, they found a pipe that it was a problem. Now you might think, well, okay, who's going to no one's going to object to a slaughter, to the idea of a slaughterhouse engaged in environmental violations being, called out for that. On the other hand, it's a slippery slope, right? Would you agree? Most people wouldn't be comfortable if, nosy neighbor down the street decides to take a thermal imaging camera and drive down the street and say, hey, that house is too warm, and then, contacts the police and say, I think that guy's growing marijuana. I think most of us would have sort of a visceral discomfort with that kind of behavior. And it's hard to just draw the distinctions sometimes between the scenario I just outlined and what you have here. So there's a lot of interesting and really important questions in terms of ways in which private unmanned aircraft could be operated in a manner that raise significant privacy concerns, both with respect to businesses and with respect to other private entities and individuals. Let me spend a few minutes on the U.S. regulatory environment. Sort of what's, in this, yes, sir?
Would the rights of paparazzis extend to the air?
Well, yeah, so.
And also, the other one that is really important to me more than anything else, what if UCLA comes and spies on our football team?
Well, okay, let's say the paparazzi is a much easier question. So we all know what a mess the paparazzi laws have been. Paparazzi have the same rights and limitations as anybody else with respect to unmanned aircraft. Now, right now, I was going to mention Minalt, but I mention it now. Commercial use of unmanned aircraft is not supposed to be allowed right now, right? So to the extent that a paparazzi, or a paparazzo, I guess is the singular, is using an unmanned aircraft for commercial purposes, the FAA would claim that that is not allowed. Now, that is a law which appears to be being broken routinely, all by real estate agents and a whole bunch of other people, right? But the FAA's position is that that is not allowed. Once that is allowed, however, or once that's unambiguously allowed, paparazzi will have the same right as other people, but that doesn't mean that they have a right, or that a stalker has a right to fly an unmanned aircraft right outside someone's second floor bedroom window and take film into it, because to me that's a very clear invasion of privacy and an actionable one. Does that mean people will not misuse these things? Of course it doesn't. People will misuse them, and that's a big concern. So it's a big concern. The UCLA football team, actually, I think we have an advantage over USC, right? Because we are not a private. So you're private, and so I think the restrictions on public entities and unmanned aircraft are very different. So I think UCLA may be able to get an authorization to fly over USC's football team, but I don't know that USC could get an authorization to fly over UCS. There's an interesting asymmetry in the law that could be exploited. So let me briefly talk about the regulatory environment. So FAA regulations classify all aircraft into one of two categories. They're either public aircraft, the police helicopter, public meaning, or civil aircraft. And public doesn't mean like a Southwest airliner is a civil aircraft, even though the public can get on it because it's operated by a private entity. And so and this distinction is very important generally and also with respect to the drones. One of the key reasons, in addition to technology, that there's so much debate about drones these days is that there was an act, a law signed, or legislation signed into law in early 2012, February 2012, that basically called for or required the FAA to integrate or provide for the integration of unmanned aircraft into the U.S. airspace by the end of 2015. Now, very few people think it's actually going to happen on that timescale, but that led to an enormous resurgence or growth of interest in, hey, these things are going to be everywhere, including projections that there's going to be thousands of these things. You're not going to be able to walk out of the grocery store 4 years from now without the sky being filled with them, right? Which is of course not going to happen. But there is this legislative mandate, right, to figure out how to integrate unmanned aircraft into the national airspace, and that has spurred a lot of discussion and a lot of debate. At the federal level, so how do people respond to that? First of all, the FAA is busy trying to craft rules to figure out how to integrate these into the airspace, and I'll talk about that briefly in just a moment. That has also led to a bunch of concerns about privacy and legislative attempts to address it. So there's been multiple bills in the 112th, 113th Congress. At the federal level, none of them have been enacted. They address things like data minimization. Data minimization is, hey, if you've acquired imagery and you don't need it, then you've got to get rid of it. You can't just sort of keep it forever so that 3 years from now you might decide, hey, let's go look and see what time he pulled out of his driveway on February 3rd, 2011. They address warrant requirements, right? Under what circumstances might police officers need a warrant to acquire certain types of imagery, data collection policies, and so on. But none of them have passed, none of them at all. At the state level, however, there's been a lot of stuff, and I'd bore you out of tears if I actually went through a state-by-state listing. So I'll simply mention that there's been lots of bills and resolutions introduced. In 2013, there were 43 states. They were enacted in 13 states. As we sit here right now, there's a bill here in California called AB 1327, specifically addressing unmanned aircraft and privacy. It was passed in both the California Senate and the Assembly, and it is sitting on the governor's desk, awaiting a signature or a veto, depending on what he decides to do. So there's a lot of legislative activity here. Another thing that's happened is the FAA has selected 6 test sites, 6 locations around the country where they're going to test these things, in particular the air traffic control and integration issues. And so there's lots of test sites all around here. Let me sort of close up by a little bit of explanation about the safety issue. So the way, and like I said, there's 3 things. There's technology, the sort of the privacy issue, which we've talked about, and there's safety integration. It's a very difficult challenge to integrate these things in the airspace. So part of the answer is simply altitude separation, right? You might say, for example, that, well, manned aircraft have to stay above 500 feet and unmanned aircraft have to stay below 400 feet. And that's part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution for 2 reasons. One is manned aircraft pass through all elevations on their way up and down to wherever they're going. And secondly, helicopters are explicitly exempt from altitude minimums. And helicopters, manned helicopters, have other requirements. You're not allowed to sort of fly a helicopter in a way that's dangerous to persons on the ground or structures and things like that, but they are specifically don't have altitude minimums. So altitude separation is part of a solution, but not a whole solution. The other thing is that the traditional way, how do you avoid aircraft? Well, one way you avoid aircraft if you're a manned aircraft is you see other things coming, right? You can see them. But as anyone here know how hard it is to sort of see an aircraft that's, and of course, aircraft can be closing at a relative velocity of 1,000 miles an hour, right? It's very hard even to see a full-size jetliner if it's, 20 miles away, right? And it's against ground clutter, for example. Now, if you try to imagine seeing something which is this big, right? It's basically impossible. So one of the more important than, I sometimes think that because the privacy issue, which is an important issue, gets so much attention, we don't pay enough attention to the airspace safety and integration issue, at least not in the scientists working on it pay a lot of attention to it, but the broader public dialogue doesn't think about it as much or talk about it as much as it deserves to be talked about. So there's a whole bunch of work going to develop what are called sense and avoid technologies. How is it that multiple aircraft of different sizes and shapes and trajectories and speeds can somehow work together to sense and avoid each other in a way that obviously you want to avoid any sort of, first and foremost, you want to avoid any kind of accident, and then secondly, you want to make the airspace usable in an efficient manner. And this involves technology challenges as well as sort of cultural or protocol challenges. I'll give you an example. Everyone here has probably heard air traffic control. If you ever listen, you're on a flight and they say, okay, well, United 623, turn left heading 51 or whatever. So the air traffic controllers have the authority, and they exercise it to basically tell aircraft, which altitudes to fly at, where to turn, things like that. The question is, how does that authority get exercised over an unmanned aircraft, right? On the one hand, the air traffic controllers need to have the ability to control the airspace. That's their job. On the other hand, they don't want so much control that they become, in effect, pilots, right? They don't want that, right? They have other things to do, not fly the 25 unmanned aircraft that may be in the little area that they have jurisdiction over. So the issues of culturally and from a protocol standpoint, how air traffic controllers will interact with operators of unmanned aircraft, and understanding that unmanned aircraft means everything from the thing this big to the Global Hawk. It's a really, really complicated set of questions. A lot of interesting scientific research going on that. And then finally, before I sort of sum things up, I'll just mention there's also a national security component. There's an issue here that needs to be thought about, that unmanned aircraft aren't stopped by the infrastructure that we have put in place to limit access, right? And so there's certainly some risk that a UAS could be misused, right, in a way that would be problematic. You can have debates over how significant that risk is, whether it's significant relative to other risks of attacks. But this is another issue, right? I mean, and this is, among other reasons why you can't fly commercial drones anywhere. You certainly can't fly even non-commercial ones in Washington, D.C., right? If you start flying things around, in fact, somebody got in some trouble a little while ago when in Adams, Morgan, I don't know if you know where that is, the north part of D.C., some guy took a little drone, flew it, and he flew it sort of towards the White House, and he sort of lost track of it. And then he put up a bunch of signs saying on telephone post, "Lost drone," right? He did, so obviously the FAA was not thrilled about that, although he found the drone on a rooftop. So there's a question that has to be asked about sort of what are the issues there. So three slides to close up, and then I'm happy to take questions now. So first of all, on the privacy issue, I think sometimes there's the suggestion that we should sort of stop the whole technology, just ban it all, right? Because there's a privacy issue, and I think that's frankly a bit of an overreaction. And you can think about analogies, things like the internet and mobile phones, which raise huge privacy issues, right? They pretty much grew as fast as their underlying technologies enabled. And then as a result, the public and the legislative dialogue regarding how to best address the privacy issues associated with things like the internet and mobile phones, that took place with a strong understanding of the benefits, right? So none of us would say, hey, this internet thing is a privacy concern, let's ban it. The way we can protect internet privacy is just ban the internet, then no one's going to have an internet privacy problem. Well, that would work, right? You wouldn't have an internet privacy problem, but you wouldn't have the internet either. Same thing with mobile phones, right? I mean, it's a real concern, I think, that records that track us everywhere we go are sort of stored everywhere, right? It's a concern. But is the answer to make mobile phones unlawful, illegal? Certainly not, right? So that by contrast with that, the privacy concerns associated with drones are getting a full kind of discussion well before anybody really understands or has realized the benefits, right? And so to the extent that, so you want the discussion to be balanced. If we were to, for example, prevent, as some legislation would do, law enforcement agencies from acquiring drones, is that really the right choice if it makes them unable to carry out a search and rescue mission to search for, you use an infrared camera on a drone to search for a lost kid in the forest at night, right? I mean, is that the right outcome? I'd argue not, right? So that's some comments on privacy. The other thing is, it's also important to sort of keep in mind the near impossibility of predicting how any technology, including unmanned aircraft, is going to develop. If you had tried in 1995, when the internet, many of you are a lot younger than I am here, but 1995 was an important year in the internet, right? Does anyone know what happened in 1995? Sorry? The browser. Good. So Netscape went public, right? And Netscape was the first widely adopted internet browser, and so that's when sort of everybody, not just sort of computer science folks, started getting access to the web and internet and things like that. At that time, if you'd said, this internet thing, great idea, but it's got a bunch of privacy issues, let's legislate what you can and can't do on the internet, you would have been having that discussion without any knowledge of social networking, right? Because nobody thought about social networking in 1995. And so the solutions you would have come up with would have been sort of snapshots that were ignorant of all these other things you couldn't possibly predict. So the same thing is true for unmanned aircraft. We think of unmanned aircraft as having a certain size, doing certain things, but if you attempt to sort of legislate based on a snapshot of this very dynamic technology, a snapshot taken today, then you're going to end up with legislation that is grossly inappropriate to the shape that these things will have in the future. And then final slide here, most aircraft are going to be unmanned. Not the ones that you get on to go on your vacation to Hawaii, but most aircraft are going to be unmanned. And here's the way I like to think of it. You can sort of think of human history as sort of being partitioned into two basic pieces, right? There's all of human history up until about 1900, in which there were no aircraft, okay? And there's all of human history sort of starting some number of decades from now, where almost all aircraft will be unmanned, okay? We just happen to have lived our lives and be living our lives in the transition zone, right? There's this brief period, historically, where almost all aircraft were manned, right? And because we have lived and grown up in that, we think of aircraft as devices that fly with people in the cockpit, flying them, right? But that's a historical aberration. It's only because it happens to be the snapshot of time where we have actually spent all of our time. The overwhelming majority of aircraft are not going to be passenger aircraft that are taking us to go on vacation in Hawaii. They're going to be a fantastic array of sizes and shapes and capabilities, things hovering in the stratosphere, tiny little things that go through cracks in homes to look for people to search and rescue after there's been a hurricane. There's an incredible array of these things that are going to happen. And as with any technology, it's like I mentioned, it's impossible to predict these things. And what is going to happen, for example, when it's possible to build unmanned aircraft that are the size of flies or even smaller? What will that mean? And I don't claim to even know the answers. But it's a fascinating area for technology, for policy, for legal issues, and that's all I have. I'm happy to take some questions if anyone has any. Yes, sir.
One of the policy issues I've heard raised is about totally autonomous aircraft, particularly in the military, where an aircraft would have the ability to identify a target and then make a decision on sanctioning that target. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so what depends on me, I'm not sure what sanction means, but yeah. So let me sort of separate that into two different things. The issue of autonomous flight, there's enormous potential, not even in a military concept, for example, for swarming, right? For having these dozens or even more unmanned aircraft operate in sort of a collective swarm, much the way you see groups of insects or birds operate and sort of break off and do things. The further issue of when you'd have automated, an actually automated, lethal weaponry is one that's a very touchy issue. The DoD, as I think the DoD has gone on record saying they are not looking at and don't plan on doing anything like that. And I would concur that that would be a very perilous step to go down. But I would also say that there's this tendency when people talk about military applications of unmanned aircraft to automatically go to an assumption that it's always going to involve missiles and lethal force, whereas the overwhelming majority of military applications of unmanned aircraft have nothing to do with shooting at anything. It's mostly reconnaissance, information gathering, and so on. So I would say, to me, what would be much more interesting is like a swarming application that might be able to stealthily, in a very quiet manner, gather air samples, for example, from near an area where you might suspect that there's some chemical weapons or something like that.
My question is more on cybersecurity in regards to drones. A while back, a story broke that basically the video feed, from certain drones was not encrypted and whatnot.
Yes.
In light of kind of proliferation of black hats and script kiddies on things like Tor, I know we're decades away from remotely operated vehicles in the civilian world, but at the military level, do you feel that's actually a major concern right now that these things can be essentially hacked?
It's a great question. So first of all, we're not decades away. I would say we're negative 3 years away, right? And yeah, it's an absolute concern. Now, I would never, I wasn't involved in the decision to send unencrypted video on on an aircraft, but that doesn't strike me as the best decision in the world. That's a different issue than whether it can be hacked. Yeah, it's a big, cybersecurity is, if you wanted to have another talk, I'd do another talk on cybersecurity. It's a huge issue. Yes, it's a really important issue. Yes, and I think the story of cybersecurity is, in a sense, the story of people assuring you that systems are secured and then being proven wrong, right? And that is going to happen in this context as well. Hopefully not in any particularly dramatic fashion. It's an incredibly important issue.
I don't know what to call this, but I'll just call it the nuisance factor. I was in a park in the UK this summer, and there were 3 groups of people that were flying those 4
The quadcopter?
the quadcopters around. These things go all over the place. And I'm trying to take a stroll in a park, and all of a sudden this thing flies over me, and then it flies around, and it changed the whole atmosphere of that, this normally a serene, beautiful park going down to the sea. And I could imagine this happening in a lot of places. If people started producing these things, you're going to have flying objects all over the place. And is there any basis in law for prohibiting something like that?
Yeah.
Not because it's invading privacy, it's just changing the atmosphere.
Well, you can, you could restrict, for example, USC's private property, right? So USC absolutely has the right to restrict various activities, Then you can have the discussion. Yeah, USC does not have the right to say that planes that are going to land at LAX can't overfly USC, right? That's the Cosby case from 1946. But USC certainly, if somebody was flying one around bothering us all on this balcony right here, I think USC would have very strong legal grounds to say, no, you can't do that. Now at UCLA, it would be a little bit of a different question. I don't know, right? Yeah, these questions are gonna arise.
And I want to go flying to Amazon ads we've seen, they're going to deliver books.
Yeah, that's great PR. That is great PR. But here's
I want to see a few Amazon.
Here's the. I got to respond to that.
Just open your window.
Yeah.
So first of all, that's autonomous. We're a long way before autonomous flight. It's really hard. Think about descending a drone through power lines and trees and all that kind of stuff. And secondly, from an energy standpoint, you can ask the question of, is it even efficient, right? The UPS truck, cumbersome though it is, you can put a lot of packages in one of those in terms of dollars per pound per mile, or however you want to it's not clear that the drones are going to be, it's a great soundbite, great headlines, but I'm not waiting for my drone-delivered tacos. Yes, sir?
Can you say something about what you expect in the short term about the FAA regulations? Do you think they'll loosen it up for specific applications?
Yeah, so so they've already done a fair amount with respect to public law enforcement, government agency drones. For privately operated unmanned aircraft, they are issuing proposed rules. The way it works is under something called the Administrative Procedures Act of 1940 something, right? Congress will enact a law, and then all the details of the rulemaking are left to the agency. So the FAA is in the midst of the rulemaking pursuant to this 2012 FAA Modernization and Reform Act. So they are going to be releasing rules, proposed rules for small, which I believe is under 55 pounds, under unmanned aircraft, and people are going to have comment on them. And so I think the goal was to do this to figure this all out by the end of 2015. The FAA has a slightly different interpretation of what that means. And the FAA, by the way, is one of the few agencies that when Congress says do something by a certain date, they can, in respectful terms, they can say no. What they say is, well, if you really make us do that, we can't be safe. And of course, then Congress is going to say, well, let's do it anyway. We said do it. Then Congress will be like, oh, well, then do your best, right? So it's going to push. But I would guess in the sort of 2016-ish time frame, you'll probably see those rules come out.
How they currently define commercial? Because I would think a researcher at a non-profit private institution flying a drone.
Well, I guess this is a subject of current disagreement in the courts. But what they would probably say is that that they wouldn't define it affirmatively, they would define it by exclusion. What they would probably say is that the only exception they have is for hobbyist use. Okay? There is a hobbyist exception. And then they would say that if you are in the hobbyist category, then you are permitted to use it. If you are not, which then would include commercial and would include university researchers at private institutions, then you're not. That is what I would guess, without being the FAA, that's what I would guess they would say.
I do have a question for you. I liked your thought about the historical artifact of manned air flight. And I wonder if the same thing isn't possibly true to some extent about privacy. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, but my sense is that human history, people have not had a lot of privacy. And to some extent, we've lived in a window of time where privacy existed on a personal level. And it may be that's a real unusual event.
Well, there's a really,
it's about to go away.
Hopefully it won't go away completely, but there's an interesting response here. Photography, when it was first introduced in the 1890s. Now, photography, of course, dates from the 1840s or 50s or 60s, but in the 1850s, if you wanted a picture, or 60s, you had to sit for a long time, right? In the 1890s, roll film, Kodak roll film was created, and it made it possible to basically take a picture right away. And that created a huge uproar, okay? Because people could take pictures, on the beach and things like that. A lot of beaches outlawed cameras. Now, of course, we assume that if we go to the beach, there are people with cameras. In fact, it was the development of instant photography that led to this classic law review article called The Right to Privacy by Brandeis and somebody else that sort of is viewed as sort of one of the founding documents of kind of modern privacy. And so you're right that conceptions, now we take it for granted that technologies exist that can capture irrefutably correct images of what we were wearing and what we were doing, right? And life has gone on. And so the standards change. I would like to think they're not going to change so much that I no longer have the right to have a conversation in my own home without expecting it to be private. But one anecdote, the person I know who's flown the most law enforcement missions is a person in Mesa County, Colorado. He's flown like 40 missions. And I asked him a little while back, I said, how many of your 40 or whatever missions were surveillance? His answer, 0. Not one. All crime scene investigation. Secondly, if you're a law enforcement officer, you'd be very frustrated if, for example, you're engaged in high-risk warrant service and you're told you can't use an unmanned aircraft to help you stay safe for that. So that would be a big concern. Thirdly, I'll make a prediction, which I'm not shy of predicting, that the greatest privacy abuses are going to come not at the hands of law enforcement. They're going to come at the hands of private citizens who behave in an irresponsible manner. And that doesn't mean we should take these away from private citizens. I just think that there's a lot of people who are out there, and the numbers are large. That's where we're going to see, I think, the more of the challenges. Anyway, you're all busy. Thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it.